The deeper researchers dive into the chronicles of past eras, the clearer a frighteningly simple thought becomes. Humanity knows practically nothing about its true past. Official history often resembles a thin screen hiding the ruins of a colossal and forgotten reality. The most striking example of this dissonance is found in the works of the famous French painter Hubert. This master, who traveled extensively across Europe, left behind a legacy that today sparks fierce debate. His canvases depicting majestic ruins amaze the viewer not just with artistic skill, but with a frightening, almost photographic precision that simply does not fit with accepted ideas about that time. Modern academic science tends to dismiss these subjects as the author's rich imagination. Art historians and historians unanimously insist that these landscapes are merely capriccios, architectural fantasies, a tribute to the fashion for antiquity and the romanticization of decay. We are asked to believe that the artist simply invented non-existent worlds to entertain a bored public. However, if we cast aside imposed stereotypes and analyze Robert's work from the perspective of an engineer or architect, a completely different picture reveals itself. We are presented with incredibly detailed colonnades, building levels going deep underground, and stone blocks fitted together with a jewelry-like precision inaccessible to the builders of his era. It creates a persistent impression that Robert was not inventing, but recording the reality surrounding him. He acted not as a dreamer, but as an honest documentarian, scrupulously sketching what he saw with his own eyes, a world that, even then in his time, lay in ruins. This hypothesis poses an uncomfortable but inevitable question. If the artist was depicting reality, then who built these cyclopean structures, and when? After all, the civilization contemporary to Robert himself looked frankly pale and, one might say, backward against the background of these remains. People of that era did not possess the technology to restore these giants, nor even to use them correctly. A strange paradox is fixed on the canvases. Majestic ruins, clearly created by a highly advanced society, coexist with primitive daily life. Grandiose halls are turned into stables, ancient temples are used as ordinary housing, and complex engineering structures are simply abandoned. Every detail in these paintings screams silently that another world once existed here, more powerful, technological, and majestic than the one that replaced it. However, what remains of this world evokes in official science only a desire to remain silent or offer ridiculous explanations. Historians habitually label any incomprehensible object whose purpose is forgotten as a temple or a tomb, turning a blind eye to obvious technical inconsistencies. But a careful look at Hubert's legacy allows us to read a different message. It is as if the artist left us an encrypted chronicle of a catastrophe, the consequences of which he witnessed. This is not just painting, it is evidence. And if we assume that these monumental sets were drawn from nature, then the entire familiar chronology of human development begins to crack at the seams, exposing the hidden truth about a vanished civilization whose traces we have not yet learned to read correctly. Immersing oneself in a detailed study of the architectural subjects captured by the master, it is impossible to shake off the obsessive sensation of disproportion that permeates every inch of the space. This feeling arises instantly when analyzing the interiors of ancient structures. For example, the famous Temple of Diana in Nîmes. The observer is presented not just with a building, but with a colossal structure featuring majestic columns and flawless masonry, the quality of which inspires awe. The space here is organized in such a way as if it were originally designed for beings of a different order, for giants whose steps shook the earth, and not for the fragile human figures we see against the backdrop of these stone giants. The ordinary people depicted in these settings seem insignificantly small, almost lost among the monumental vaults. They look not like the masters or creators of these walls, but like accidental guests, ants crawling at the foot of ancient trees. This visual contrast creates a powerful cognitive dissonance. Architectural details, such as perfectly fitted blocks, arches, and vaults, calculated to withstand colossal loads, testify to the highest level of engineering thought and construction technology. It is difficult to imagine that such structures could have been erected by methods available in the era when the painter's contemporaries wandered through these ruins. Moreover, the lower levels of many buildings are clearly submerged in the soil, indicating processes of burial, evidence of catastrophic events that occurred long before these views were transferred to canvas. This Lilliputian syndrome manifests even more vividly in landscapes depicting waterways and canals. Long canals stretching into the perspective are framed by massive ruins of arches and colonnades, the scale of which overwhelms the imagination. The arches rise to such a height that human figures against their background turn into barely distinguishable dots, foreign objects accidentally caught in the frame. The construction technique here is no less striking. Flawless geometry, complex ornaments that seem to repeat precise mathematical calculations, and vaults capable of withstanding incredible pressure. All this creates the impression that we are looking at the remains of the infrastructure of a civilization that possessed technologies inaccessible to the understanding of people of subsequent eras. People wandering along the banks of these grandiose canals or under the vaults of ruined temples behave like passive observers. In their actions, there is neither creation nor understanding of the essence of the objects surrounding them. They seem to live in the shadow of giants, unaware of the true grandeur of their surroundings. There is a persistent feeling that these Lilliputians have populated an empty shell left by someone much more powerful. They do not look like builders capable of designing and erecting such miracles. On the contrary, their presence emphasizes the gap, the deep abyss between the creators of these architectural masterpieces and those who came to replace them. This dissonance between the scale of the buildings and the insignificance of their new inhabitants suggests that the humanity depicted in the paintings is a kind of parasitic element on the body of a dead giant. New generations simply occupied the vacated space, having not the slightest idea how this world functioned at the height of its prosperity. They wander among the debris, using it as a background for their primitive life, not asking the question of who actually erected these walls. And if these people did not build the splendor surrounding them, then a legitimate and disturbing question arises. Who was the true architect of this vanished reality? And where did those for whom these cyclopean sizes were normal actually go? The answer to this question lies not in history textbooks, but in exactly how the new tenants managed the incomprehensible inheritance they received. What is revealed to the gaze upon further study of Hubert Roberts' legacy can be characterized as a chronicle of the deepest civilizational decline. If previous observations concerned the mismatch of scales, now the glaring technological and cultural gap between the creators of the majestic ruins and those who inhabit them comes to the fore. A picture unfolds before us of the life of a society that can boldly be called a civilization of scavengers, or inhabitants of a post-apocalyptic world who have forgotten their past. This is especially vivid in subjects where grandiose antique structures are used completely for other than their intended purposes, adapted for primitive domestic needs. Studying scenes depicting public baths among the ruins, we see a striking contrast. Massive stone vaults, majestic colonnades, and perfectly designed arches capable of withstanding colossal pressure serve merely as a decoration for washing clothes and bathing bodies. The water filling these reservoirs might once have been part of a complex hydraulic system, the purpose of which is unknown to us, but for the people in the painting, it is simply a convenient puddle fenced with stone. They splash in the shadow of engineering masterpieces, unaware that they are inside a complex technical device or a sacred complex, the level of creation of which is incomparably higher than their own understanding of the world. Such a utilitarian, almost barbaric attitude towards heritage is traced everywhere. Temples with flawless proportions and decor, requiring high-precision equipment for stone processing, are turned into public pools, market squares, or pens for livestock. Consider, for example, structures resembling the famous square house, Maison Carrée, in Nîmes. This massive stone building with columns clearly had an important functional significance. However, on the canvases, we see people aimlessly wandering around, or those trying to adapt its walls for drying hay or organizing temporary shelter. Fragments of capitals and cornices lie around, which no one tries to restore or put in place. The locals simply possess neither the tools nor the knowledge to lift these multi-ton blocks, let alone carve new ones. New generations use these spaces only as a ready-made background for survival. They build nothing of equal value, but merely parasitize on the remains of former greatness. Their own buildings are flimsy wooden shacks and sheds that look like pathetic growths on the body of stone giants. This clearly demonstrates the total loss of construction technologies. The secrets of polygonal masonry, precise sawing of hard rocks, and the erection of seismic-resistant structures were irretrievably lost. Society has rolled back to primitive manual labor and is now forced to inhabit the skeleton of a deceased, highly advanced civilization, like savages who have settled in an abandoned skyscraper. The original functions of these buildings have been erased from the memory of generations. What we habitually call temples or thermal baths could have been factories, power stations, or scientific centers. But since knowledge is lost, people invent simple explanations for these objects, reducing everything to religion or elementary daily life. It is difficult to shake the thought that we are looking at the documented consequences of a global catastrophe. This is not the natural evolution of architecture, but survival in the ruins. Such a picture of the world evokes a disturbing sense of the irreversibility of loss. We see a society struck by collective amnesia. They walk on slabs under which great secrets are hidden, but they are interested only in how to take shelter from the rain under a surviving vault. This break in continuity suggests that the civilization that built these wonders did not just fade away smoothly, passing the baton to descendants. It disappeared suddenly, leaving behind only stone and feral heirs incapable of even reading the message encrypted in the architecture. But what force could wipe a culture possessing such powerful potential off the face of the earth, turning its achievements into mysterious decorations for the life of simple laymen? The answer to this question may hide not in what remains standing, but in exactly how these structures were destroyed. A careful analysis of Hubert Robert's canvases inevitably leads to the next, even more frightening discovery, which concerns not just the preservation of buildings, but the very landscape in which they are inscribed. If we discard the usual version that ruins are the result of centuries of natural decay, a picture of the consequences of a massive geological cataclysm appears before our eyes. The buildings in these paintings are not just destroyed by time, they are literally buried alive. Huge masses of soil, clay, and earth hide the lower floors, changing the familiar geometry of space and forcing us to think about the nature of the catastrophe that covered this ancient world. Looking at the image of the ruins of a classical Doric temple, one can notice a strange pattern. Majestic columns, whose proportions speak of a striving for ideal harmony, do not stand on a solid foundation, but seem to be drowning in deposits of earth. Part of the colonnade has collapsed, and the chaotic scattering of giant stone segments testifies to an instantaneous and powerful impact. This does not look like the slow death of architecture under wind and rain. The picture resembles the consequences of a massive shockwave or earthquake, followed by a flow of mud that filled the space between the debris. Vegetation is already breaking through the thickness of this new soil, which has hidden foundations and, possibly, entire underground levels, forever sealing the secrets kept below. Even more disturbing questions are raised by the image of the Colosseum. On Robert's canvases, this symbol of Rome appears not as a solemn arena of antiquity, but as a giant, semi-abandoned technogenic object that has survived a global flood or mudflow. The lower tiers of arches, which logically should serve as entrances at ground level, are half or even more hidden under a thick layer of soil. Official historiography loves to explain such phenomena by the accumulation of the so-called cultural layer. We are told that over 1,500 years, garbage and dust raised the ground level by several meters. However, any engineer or geologist will confirm the absurdity of such a statement regarding the scales recorded by the artist. To bury the first floor of such a grandiose structure as the Colosseum requires not dust from the sandals of citizens, but millions of cubic meters of dense rock. Such burial does not happen by itself. This is a characteristic sign of liquid soil, a mudflow, tsunami, or soil liquefaction caused by a planetary catastrophe. The building looks as if it stood in the path of a colossal mudflow, which, having receded, left behind meters of sedimentary rocks, turning the first floors into basements. Arches that once admitted thousands of spectators have now turned into burrows one can barely squeeze into. This is visual evidence that the catastrophe occurred relatively recently, by the standards of the depicted era, as the ruins have not yet had time to completely level with the ground, but the landscape has already changed beyond recognition. The nature of the destruction and the soil level in Robert's paintings speak of one thing. The history we are taught misses a key event. An event that did not just destroy an empire, but literally reshaped the surface of the earth, burying the achievements of high culture under a layer of clay and silt. We see the tips of icebergs, the upper tiers of buildings, while the main part of the infrastructure lies deep beneath the feet of the careless inhabitants of the New World. And if even such a giant as the Colosseum looks like merely the tip of a more complex structure sticking out of the ground, this forces us to completely reconsider the purpose of these objects. After all, if the greater part of the building is hidden, how can we judge its true function? Were these structures really just palaces, temples, and arenas for entertainment? Or is their visible part just a casing hiding complex mechanisms and systems underneath, the meaning of which was lost along with the buried floors? Shifting the focus from artistic expressiveness to engineering logic, the researcher inevitably faces the need to rethink the very purpose of the depicted objects. If we discard the romantic flair and look at the ruins through the eyes of a technologist, familiar names like villa, pavilion, or port begin to seem like naive labels stuck on complex technical devices, the true function of which has been forgotten. What is customarily considered decorative elements of garden and park art reveals signs of large-scale industrial complexes of the past upon closer inspection. A striking example of such a discrepancy is the depiction of so-called pavilions with cascades. At first glance, this is an idyllic landscape created to delight the eyes of the nobility. However, the structure of the water flow and the stone masonry framing it speak otherwise. The cascade here does not look like a natural phenomenon or a light decoration. It is rigidly built into a massive stone structure with clear geometry, terraces, and spillways. Such architecture resembles the remains of a dam, a lock system, or even a hydroelectric power station more than a park ornament. The massiveness of the walls and the precision of the block processing indicate that the structure was designed to work with colossal water pressure and immense energies. For a simple fountain, such excessive strength and complexity are completely unnecessary. Likely, the artist captured a fragment of a lost water supply system or an energy node, which over time, having lost its mechanisms, turned into a picturesque waterfall, and its concrete or stone skeleton was adapted as a place for walking. Similar questions arise when analyzing objects such as Villa Madama. The viewer is presented with a structure that in the 18th century already looked like a relic of another era. The internal volumes, the height of the arches, and the thickness of the walls are absolutely excessive for a residential house, even a very rich one. Huge empty halls which are impossible to effectively heat or light with the means of that time resemble factory floors, hangars, or public terminals rather than cozy chambers. A persistent impression forms that the architects of the Renaissance and subsequent centuries did not build these buildings from scratch, but merely engaged in redecorating the surviving boxes of ancient industrial or administrative centers. They inserted windows into giant openings, laid floors, and hung tapestries, trying to inhabit a space that was originally intended for completely different, probably technical purposes. The industrial trace becomes even more obvious when looking at port structures, such as the port of Ripetta. Here, urban development literally grows into ancient megalithic foundations. Embankments, stairs, and retaining walls are made of blocks of such size and quality of fitting that it evokes associations with modern concrete fortifications of strategic objects. This is not just a pier for wooden boats. It is an engineering structure of high culture, calculated for centuries of operation and serious loads. City life flows on top of these ruins, using them as an indestructible foundation, but not understanding the principles of their creation. It looks like parasitism on the remains of highly developed infrastructure, where complex logistical nodes of the past are used as simple wharves. Taken together, these observations form an image of a world permeated by a complex engineering network, of which only a stone skeleton remains. We see not separate buildings, but nodes of a single system. Stations, factories, hydraulic complexes. The tragedy of the situation lies in the total loss of understanding of how this system works. People in the paintings live inside a broken mechanism, perceiving its parts as elements of the landscape. This brings us to perhaps the most poignant image in Robert's work, the lonely hermit praying amidst giant ruins. This figure becomes a metaphor for all humanity of that era. Man bows his head before a greatness the nature of which he is unable to comprehend. He offers prayers in a space that was possibly a machine hall or a laboratory. For him, these walls are sacred only because they are grandiose and incomprehensible. He seeks a spiritual answer where precise calculation and technology once reigned, finally affirming the victory of myth over knowledge. Summarizing this large-scale investigation, the figure of Hubert Robert appears before us in a completely different light. From a talented artist subject to the fashion for romanticizing decay, he transforms into a key witness of an era that can boldly be called the time of the world's reset. His legacy ceases to be just a collection of paintings and acquires the status of a detailed photo report from the crash site of a highly advanced civilization. Each painting is a documented fact, a piece of evidence preserved to this day despite the attempts of time and man to erase the memory of the true past. Robert did not invent ruins. He recorded the moment when the traces of a global catastrophe were still fresh, when the giant skeletons of buildings had not yet been dismantled for building materials, and the cultural layer brought by the flood had not yet been hidden under new paving stones. Official historical science, facing such visual evidence, finds itself in an extremely uncomfortable position. Academic circles prefer either to modestly remain silent, ignoring inconvenient details, or offer explanations that do not withstand any criticism upon closer inspection. We are asked to believe that cyclopean structures, requiring complex logistics, mathematical modeling, and machine processing of stone for their erection, were built with primitive tools for religious or burial purposes. The universal answer, "It is a temple," or "It is a tomb," has become a convenient screen behind which hides a lack of understanding of the true purpose of these technogenic objects. But the longer we look into these temples, the clearer we see workshops, stations, and engineering nodes, the meaning of which was lost along with their creators. The eyes cannot be deceived, even if textbooks insist otherwise. A panorama of a world unfolds before us that was not just different, but grander, more complex, and more technological than ours. We are used to thinking of progress as a linear process leading from the primitive to the complex. But the ruins in Robert's painting scream the opposite, of involution, of the loss of knowledge and the degradation of technologies. We see a society that did not develop, but survived on the rubble of titans, adapting their heritage to its modest needs. This realization evokes a dizzying sense of loss, but at the same time, incredible curiosity. After all, if these buildings existed, it means the history of humanity was completely different, filled with events and achievements that we forgot to be told about. These canvases serve as a reminder of the fragility of civilization. What seems unshakable today may tomorrow become a mysterious ruin for descendants who will guess at the purpose of our cities. Hubert Robert and other master ruinists left us keys to solving this mystery. Perhaps they understood that soon these traces would disappear, be built over, restored beyond recognition, or finally destroyed, and they hurried to capture the truth on canvas. Their works are a message in a bottle thrown through the centuries, in the hope that one day there will be those who can read it correctly, casting aside imposed dogmas. Today we stand before a choice. Continue to blindly believe approved versions where everything is shelved neatly but does not add up in facts, or trust our own eyes and logic. History was rewritten, but stone remembers everything. The ruins captured by Robert continue to silently testify to a world that was stolen from us, and it depends only on us whether we want to return this memory. If you are ready to ask inconvenient questions, look for alternative answers, and look at familiar things from a new angle, this path is just beginning. Subscribe to the channel, study archival materials, and share your thoughts. Do you believe the textbooks or what you see with your own eyes? The truth is somewhere nearby, among buried columns and ruined arches, and the time has come to find it.